Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. My name is Sara Jolena Wolcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. In this podcast, we offer up to you, dear listener, 3 forms of episodes to support your journey of remembering and re-enchanting. First, conversations with amazing people. Second, storytelling. And third, myth casting. In this episode, we're going to bring you a conversation between myself and another amazing, fascinating leader in the areas of remembering and re-enchanting. Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. I'm super delighted today to be joined with on this conversation with Jessica Intermill, and she is a land history consultant, which I think is an amazing title that we were just saying right as we are jumping on the call. Like, this is a very unusual title. Jessica, thank you so much, and welcome to the Remembering Re-Enchanting podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be in conversation and community.
Yes, conversation and community. And that's how we met, right? We met through the Land Justice Futures um, like first big course that they did in 2024. I think there's going to be more coming in the future. And you gave a really beautiful talk as part of that course. Um, and I have heard many people talk about land history, and I've participated in many land history conversations. Um, but I haven't like heard your talk was very unique and very special. And I think the work you do is something that's pretty unique and pretty special and really, really needed right now. So I'd love to hear like how do you when we say land history, what does that evoke for you? And how did you get into thinking about land history?
So for me, land history is just a different entry into people's stories.
Mm,
At base, that's what all of this is. And it's just a different lens to look into what has happened to people and what people have done to the land and to each other. I um, I came into this work in a sort of a strange direction. Should introduce myself that I'm a Jewish white girl from Nebraska. That is my core identity. I carry whiteness every day, and also growing up as a person who is Jewish in a place where there are not many Jews, especially towards the end of each year, right about after Thanksgiving, all of a sudden it would be very clear that I did not belong in my hometown, in my school. That was a place for Christians, and I was not one. And sometimes that was very express. Other times it was just sort of atmospheric. But every year at the end of the year, so as soon as December 26th hit, but certainly by the time January 1st did, everything went back to quote unquote normal. And I belonged again. And that was really disorienting because what it showed me is it gave me the ability to see my whiteness and to see when I was in and when I was out. And that gave me the capacity to look around and see who is not at the table, who is not invited, and who do we need to invite in. So that's sort of my core who I am. And then I grew up and went to law school and came to Minnesota for school, started practicing law, pretty quickly moved into the practice of federal Indian law, which means for me meant representing tribes, often in treaty litigation. That means that I would go to federal courts and ask the United States to uphold its promises.
mm,
And sometimes that worked, right? Like there were some really amazing victories and also some really heartbreaking losses. And So when 2020 came around and all of a sudden we were not in courtrooms anymore, and there was a kiddo who was going to school in my living room, um, that's when I sort of stepped back and realized, the stories that I learned to tell in treaty litigation, which are stories of how the United States negotiated, what it negotiated for, what its priorities were, and stories of resistance, of how tribal nations would adapt and um, flex to try to protect their constituents in the face of empire, that those stories might not be ones that the guys in black robes sitting in on judges' benches really wanted to hear all the time,
Mm.
but they are important stories that other people wanted to hear.
Oh, interesting. So it's like your sense of your potential audience shifted.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
And partly that was informed by the uprising in Minneapolis because I lived here through the murder of George Floyd and the resulting backlash. And people really sort of woke up and looked around and said, "What are we doing here?" And I was
Mm,
like, "Oh, wait, I actually have a little bit of an answer to that,
mm,
right? At least of how we got here." And so that's when I invented the profession of land history consultant and essentially brought that treaty litigation learning and storytelling to people, organizations, churches, congregations, really anyone who wants to learn the story that we are already in, but we aren't taught.
mm. So part of what I really appreciate about this narrative that you're saying, like this is just because I do so much work on thinking about time and time's relationship to place. Um, is how you're starting it thinking about it was that sort of that Christmas tide, that Christmas season, and that time of year that for you, like because you were not in a Christian family, like was this dissonance from everyone else around you, and what I'm presuming is a predominantly white Christian community in Nebraska, and how like, and then there was so like that out of time, out of place was like brought together in your own experience. And that probably helped you understand both time and place in some ways better, or at least understand like the construct of the nature of what we call reality. Uh, yeah.
And it's interesting that identity has also played out and informed my understanding as a person who works with tribal nations,
Mm,
as the American Jewish experience is one of diaspora, right? We were kicked out, we were kicked out, we were kicked out, and eventually we ended up in America. And all of the traditions and practices that I value are ones that are very portable.
mm,
So it's song, it's
mm,
candlesticks, it's food,
mm,
it's things that you can pick up very quickly and run when you need to, because at some point you're going to need to again. And
mm,
that's sort of embedded in those practices.
mm,
Um, but working with tribal nations, especially ones that had not been removed from their original places, from the places that they are indigenous to, was again a little bit disorienting because I would learn things like I worked with one tribe that had bent the tree trunks in a certain way to create a council circle. So this is essentially the people would hang weights from branches and from the tree trunk so that the trunk itself would bend. It would create like a Tetris piece instead of a straight line. And you could go and see them if you knew where to go look. But the idea that this is something that someone would have to do for decades to make this happen and to have stories attached to that place that are millennia old, I was like, wow, that's totally different for a cultural frame. And to be tied to place in that way is something that I had not experienced, but could appreciate and could help try to translate that story to folks who don't have that, because so many of us in the United States came from other places, obviously. It's a different worldview and a different relationship to place that was just sort of a smack in the face when I realized that. I was like, oh, for you, culture is land. For me, culture is running, but for you, culture is place.
Do you think that the general American culture is a culture of running or a culture of place or
I
something else?
I think that the general American culture is one of moving
Mhm.
and transition. So, for example, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there would actually be holidays called Moving Day, where all of the rental agreements would expire on the same day. Everyone would pick up, move out, try not to pass the new owners or the new renters in the hallway, and go to the next place. And this was like so ingrained that visitors from other countries would come just to see it, right? And it was this idea of American mobility. I think that is part of the majoritarian culture. And I think that is different than is true for Indigenous communities. Now, there will still be movement within traditional Indigenous communities, but it will be within a, a sort of a set location, not I'm picking up and I'm moving westward ho, right? Like that was not the idea. And that is ingrained in American culture. But what really fascinates me about land history is that all of those stories start stacking on top of each other so that in one place, you'll have both an indigenous worldview that is tied to the place and the transitory worldview of the white Americans who passed through the place. And today we'll be standing, in my case, I can be on a street corner on Minnehaha Avenue, which is named after a Dakota place, but is present today. And it's on a grid system that is there because that's how the United States carved the land into little pieces to commodify it. All of those things are true today, even though they're from different points in time.
Hmm. Right, like, and so often the general narrative is like a sweeping narrative, like a sweeping through time and across places. Whereas like you're kind of like, well, what if you just look at the one singular land location that you are, this particular land? Um, and what are all the different layers of histories that are on top and within and around it? Like, and like what's the different like dimensions of what of being of this here-ness, of this particular understanding of here-ness?
And of who we are too, right? Like that here-ness, and this is where the storytelling comes in. These are essentially stories of all of us. It looks at then what are our responsibilities both to understand what has come before us and to create the future we want next. Because if we're standing in that one place and considering the different layers, then there's more layers to come, and we have agency in those.
Mm-hmm. 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 Right. And that's like because the we are in time and the land is in time and we
Mhm.
are all in time together, rather than time being like an outside thing that we're kind of a drama against which our lives are the background or against which our lives are played. Yeah, it's like we're kind of like in it in a different way. Yeah, I
And
could.
it's less linear than we're taught, right? Like we're taught history in a book, and you turn the page and you go to the next one, and the first thing's done. But it's
Mm,
not,
mm,
right? We still have the Dakota place name from when
mm,
it was Dakota land before we dispossessed.
mm,
And so there's a fullness that land history can show that is just much, much different than how the United States teaches time.
mhm, 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 mhm. So when people come to you and you work with organizations and churches and individuals, and they want to kind of understand the land history of the land that they're in, better, like where do you tend to start? And
Um,
there
so
are
I'm,
maybe certain places.
I love being a little research bug. That's my jam. And there are different databases that have different things. And so usually I start with the location, first figure out which treaty ceded the land, and cede, it's from a verb, CEDE. So we'll talk about cession or ceding land. The treaty is essentially just the legal instrument that moves the land from a tribe to the United States. And most of the United States is covered by those treaties, but not all. And sometimes there's just no treaty there and it's just outright theft. But I'll look at the terms of the treaty to see, and this is where my kind of lawyer training comes in. What did the United States promise? What did it actually carry out? And sometimes go a little bit backward to say, why even is this tribe in this place? Because sometimes the tribe that gives the land to the United States is not the one that is from that place. It is the one that the United States moved to that place at a different point. And so this is where you start building in these layers of stories and of different people. And then I'll move to what is called a patent. And this is the United States' first transfer of land from the government to a private party. And the United States did that a variety of ways. Sometimes it was straight up sale. We actually have pictures of people lined up at land offices to come stake their claim. And this is where that idea comes from. But sometimes it was a little more, not convoluted, but a little less direct. So, for example, the United States, when it was first formed, and for a long time, was not a cash-rich country. It did not have a big treasury, but it did have big debts because it had just fought this Revolutionary War, and then another war, and then another war, and it had all these soldiers that it needed to pay for their service, and so it would pay in land. It would essentially get a coupon called land scrip, and the soldier would then be able to cash in, not for cash, but for 40 acres, 80 acres, 160 acres. And a lot of those soldiers didn't actually want to move and go find a home on the frontier. So they would sell that coupon, that script, to an investor who would buy it for pennies on the dollar, and then by the other soldier and the other soldier and the other soldiers. And then that investor would go get the frontier land. So there's all of these sorts of stories then that build up, and they almost all become the narrative of how land is commodified and how people are disconnected from relationship to the land, but all of them are about how land becomes property.
Right. I mean, like it was so interesting as you're telling this story. I can just feel like the commodification of the land, like pay in land, right? Like as a notion that, and it's like it evokes both that kind of in my remembering course, I like to start the history of private property with the Roman Empire, and like thinking about how Caesar and how the emperor would pay generals and the military that who had supported him in land, and that eventually is part of how Rome itself becomes like the city of Rome. Um, it's like that same concept is then repeated throughout Western imperial relationality to land. And there's this sort of the commodification of land. And here in the context of what we think of as the United States and Canada, like the land had not been commodified before.
Mm-mm.
It had no experience. Like the land itself had no experience of being commodified and of being put into like put fences around it and put into maps and like drawn into maps. Like it had never been abstracted in that particular way. And I'm like, as you go through these histories, like and how do some of the people you're working with, I imagine, like experience, how do you experience how the land experienced that process of becoming a commodity instead of a living being?
It's really interesting because a lot of the treaty boundaries
Mm,
are natural features. So it will be
Yeah.
the land westward
Right.
until the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
There's one that's really strange that's nearby where I live in Minnesota, and I was like, why is that? Why didn't they use the river? There's this little sliver to the east. And when you look at topographical maps, there's a bluff there. And so the Dakota in that particular treaty had said, but we want that bluff because that is important to us. Um, it almost looks like it's an error when you look at the maps because it's just like, why is there this skinny little thing? But those sorts of um, natural features absolutely were part of the treaty making period. And the commodification was straight lines, and nothing stopped the straight lines except for water. It is fascinating to look at how these maps look across mountains, how they look across bluffs and plains, and really these grid lines, which folks from the country know. They'll know them as township lines. But even folks in the city will know because they're the street names, because that commodification, that slicing up and making into little squares, we live today because of course those became property borders that then the cities built the roads between. And so when we sort of step back, I think anyone can catch their breath and notice what a difference a relationship between a human and the land is when it is, when you're looking at an unbroken prairie, a forest, a river. That's different than when you're looking at the signpost at the corner. And the signpost at the corner suggests that we have dominion over the land and that we should, and that that's natural, that it's always been there. But when we tell these stories and look back to when it was not there, because it was not inevitable and it was not always true, then we can see that humans are not at the center of the circle, but instead we're just part of a circle.
Mm.
And that can shift our relationship to lots of different things. I mean, when we look at climate change is because we think we have dominion over the earth. If we look at species extinction, if we look at how we treat each other, because all of that dominion idea is rooted in very toxic doctrines from eons and eons ago that continue today in these forms. And we don't, when we think about the doctrine of discovery, we can say, which is the idea that in the beginning that Catholicism should have all of the things, but then moving to Christianity should have all of the things, and then manifest destiny, it should really just be white folks should have all of the things in the United States. Those ideas really separated us not just from the land, but from each other by saying that certain people have agency over others. And we think about them as being in the past, but when we see them in our gridded streets, right, in our housing deed, we can see that they still live with us today.
Mm. Mm. Mhm. And even that phrase of like, what does it mean to look at the unbroken prairie, right? Like,
Mhm.
like the phrase unbroken. Like, we can almost pass over the word, not recognizing like, oh yeah, something was broken.
Mhm.
It was a break. And the land experienced like through these divisions, there was like the animacy of the land began to be broken in the minds of those who were living in it.
Mhm.
Although which is not to say that the animacy of the land is ever actually broken, more that we have forgotten that those that particularly white folks and others who follow the trajectory set out for them are forced into a position of forgetting.
And like I come from those people. My dad grew up on a farm, and there it's funny that even the commercialized agriculture of today is even farther removed compared to, the earlier family farm, right, where you would still tend to the soil,
Mm.
rather than append it. I mean, you would still append it. There would still be fertilizers and such, but when you depended on the land for food instead of depending on the corporation to pay the bill for the food, there was a closer relationship than there is now. And the
Mm.
farther we get from that relationship, the the worse off all of us get. Which, like, I'm a big fan of the grocery store. I'm not gonna go in like I'm good at growing green beans and nothing else. Um, but when we shift that attitude, I think that's when we can have different relationships with each other.
You know that apples grow from trees.
I do, but I don't have apple trees.
Right, right, right. Yep. Yeah. I'm curious as you're talking about like this generational component. So like, is it different for you when you work for people from different generations? Like how they experience these histories and how they tell land stories? Like how are like what kind of different like is there a generational component or are there other divisions that are more important in how people think about land? What differences?
I hadn't thought about that. I think there are generational components.
Mhm.
Um, and I think some of them are longer generational lines than others, but that one of the things that I've realized is that those generational lines are important to everyone, Indigenous or not.
Mm.
So for example, when I was litigating a case where the tribe had not been removed. So when they talk about stewarding the land for generations, they mean to their origin story. But the case also had some folks who had been using the same area as vacation homes for generations, since the Ford money of Chicago times and, very the Industrial Revolution, basically. And the white property owners would say, "We've been here for generations. You can't change the rules." And they meant it, right? Like in some ways it'd just be like, are you kidding me? Do you know who, like, did you know who you were talking to when you say that? But on the other hand, they meant it too. And the land is important to them too. And the places are important to them in different ways, but not less important. And so I think part of holding land history is holding that and holding that multiple things can be true. Just because a place is important to one person doesn't mean it's not to another. And that's hard, right? That's hard and that's messy.
Yeah, it's very messy and it's very true. And um yeah, I almost every place I've been, that's been the case that there's people have like I've heard stories from, in California or in New York, across the what's now the United States, and that has very much been the case that people have very strong emotional um, tales and stories and attachments to land for very, very different reasons.
Mhm.
The reasons are often like almost sometimes non-comprehensible to the other person. But like you
Right?
haven't been here for 20 years. How can this be important to you? And it's, for like but it is. Like it
Mhm.
symbolizes something in that person's in their imagination.
Well, and that's so that makes me think of my kiddo who we have my husband has a brother who lives in New York, and kiddo loves to go to New York City. Like they just vibrate at the same frequency as New York. And if you ask them where their favorite place is, I'm sure that would be at the top of the list, even though they've spent a grand total of like what, 10 days there. I don't know. Um, but it's important to them
Yeah.
and it matters to them. So I think sometimes it's generational, but sometimes it's like I had an important thing happen there, and that's what I need to learn about. And I love when people can just follow those intuitions and say, this is what's calling to me. I'm going to go learn that.
Mhm. Mhm. And the land calls to people at all times in
Mhm.
different ways.
Mhm.
Different people, sometimes, yeah, right. There's a messiness if we get into the reality of people's feelings and hearts.
Yeah. And
So,
in land history, it just hits in different, it seems to hit in a different way than like I can tell a story about how, I mean, we've all heard and understood the story of dispossession and empire that the United States executed against Indigenous peoples. But when you know the specifics of who and how it happened at a place, it can break your brain and your heart open in a way that is just different and allows us to reach the messy parts in ways that, just reading it in a book doesn't quite do.
can you give an example?
So, okay, the one that got me, this is my personal one, which is kind of crazy. So my lineage is different on different sides. My mom and dad. My dad is descended from pre-revolutionary folks who have been here a very, very long time. Christian folks. My mom, her family immigrated just uh, two generations before her. One generation, depending on which kid was born in what place, and came from Ukraine and Romania, escaping pogroms. My When I was researching the history of New York City, was looking at how first, before it was New York, it was New Amsterdam. The first settlers came over and settled really at the tip of Lower Manhattan, created their colony there, actually built a wall that is often heard as, well, it was there to keep the natives out. No, it was there to keep the English out because the English were trying to come in too. But folks who know New York will know that that wall is where Wall Street is now. That's what it gets its name from. The second group that came over and settled went just a little bit more north around where Wall Street is. But there's one guy named Jonas Bronk, Bronk, who came in that second voyage and just didn't want to live in the same spot as the colony. So he went on the other side of the river, made up his farm over there, other side of what we now know as the Harlem River. And he, when he immigrated over, brought his family and two indentured servants. And you can actually find the contract for those indentured servants because New Amsterdam kept very good records. And the contract says that the servants had to clear a certain amount of land per year, so that because New York at that point was covered in trees, rocks, etc., it was a forest, an island forest. Um, had to clear so much land to create the farm for Mr. Bronk, which is to say Mr. Bronk's farm, now known as the Bronx. That was the origin of that name. And the men who did this, one of them was my 13th great grandfather. So my 13th great grandfather cleared the land in a place where my great grandfather on my mom's side, so 13th grade on dad's side, cleared the land where my mom's grandfather came and found safe haven entering through Ellis Island. Both of those things happened in the same place. And the dispossession of the indigenous people that my great grandfather did happened. So on the one hand, I could be like, oh, you were an indentured servant. That's awful. On the other hand, I can say, oh, you totally dispossessed a people. That's awful. And then part of me too is like, man, but I'm kind of glad that you did because it created a safe space for my mom's people. And so holding all of that at once can break you open and tie you to a place in ways that just passing through doesn't do.
Mm.
And learning those stories and learning those people can open me to the complexity now that someone who I'm really pretty angry with right now because of whatever, geopolitical stuff is happening right now, I can step back and say, okay, but who are you an indentured servant to? And who did you create space for? And how can we hold all of that today?
Mhm. I'm as you work with yourself and with others in that breaking open process, like how do you support people in that bigger holding?
One of the first things that I do after we go through a land history story, because the story itself will just be a deluge of information that, sometimes some of the names, but how they connect are not things you've ever heard before. Um, what I ask folks to do after that, before we do questions, is just put both feet on the ground and take breaths together and explain that the way that our brains are built, everything goes in through the front brain, and the front brain decides, is this a threat or not? And very often, this information will come through to white folks as a threat.
Mm.
And your body, of course, does not know the difference between a threat to your identity and, oh my gosh, there's really a bear there, right? Your heart rate goes up, your shoulders tighten, your stomach turns, your pupils dilate. Like all of those things happen, even though there's not a bear there. And
Mhm.
so my job after I give the information is to then have folks take those calming breaths to recenter, to feel that the floor is supporting them, the chair is supporting them, that they're not actually near a bear. And then that helps people move to, okay, I'm not actually under attack right now. What can I do with this information?
You understand? I'm so curious about this. Like, how do you understand how the deluge of information is experienced primarily by especially by white folks as an attack to, as you say, it's sort of people often experience as an attack to identity. How do you understand why that happens? Why they might move into that, oh my God, and being attack space?
You know, I, I don't know if I do understand it, first of all. Like, I just know that it happens.
Right.
My guess, I mean, when I think about it from my own experience, is that we are so invested in certain places that those places become our identity in ways that are, I can say I'm a Jewish white girl from Nebraska. The from Nebraska part is really important to how that happened. Um, and someone's family farm, someone's church, someone's where they grew up. Those are all places that imprint on us in ways that are alive and real. And so especially when we have a conversation about who else that place might belong to and be part of, then it's so instinctual, I think, just to be like, no, it's mine. It was special to me. And that's I think the piece that even apart from or stepping back from race, class, gender, etc., it's like, but I experienced that. And now you're telling me that somebody else did too. And yes, I am. And I'm then going to take the step to tell you it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying has been making me think about some of the, when I think about my own process of retelling my own family stories and our relation, the stories of the United States as it relates to the doctrine of discovery. Um, how I keep moving, trying like the that sense of like there's almost like I think one of the first times I realized how my family story and the family story of, in this case, a woman who was had both Black and Native heritage, how we told the same set of events in completely different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember, and I tell the story a great deal. I do remember like I caught my breath in such a way, and I think I was afraid that because we were sitting right next to each other, I think there was some part of me that was afraid that she was going to kill me and or that I was going to like just fall into a deep dark pit of something and never come out again. And I often, when I look back at that moment, and neither of those things happened, but when I look back at that moment, it's like the way that I held my breath in that moment. I often think of it as almost two parts. One, like if justice was to be served, she would on some, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, have a right to kill me, right? Like that there, if in some sort of like a harsh justice kind of way, I could understand why she either would want to or might have that right. And at the flip side, that so much of my sense of self, that my family taught me and that my country teaches me, uh, there's a there's it's drenched in a certain type of self-centeredness. And I don't actually, I mean that like in a big way, actually, but
Mhm.
like it's like that your identity and who you think you are is like it's very self-centered, right? And instead of a a core value of interbeing, my identity comes because of what my people did, and to some extent who they were, not in their relationship with others. And so like the reality is that like the relationship with others is what enabled them to survive and
Right.
to subsequently gain a certain degree of wealth and prosperity at the expense of other people. But like that requires an interbeing, a historical interbeingness that our culture doesn't engender us with. And we don't like we actually we and I am speaking of people with with historical privilege, but I think it's really like it's not just that, right? Like many people have this from many different ethnic backgrounds. Like there's a tension, like are you relational? Like is your historical narrative one of relationality? And our country does not support a historical narrative interbeing.
And that's super interesting because part of the federal land story is one of rugged individuality, right? Like that's the myth. It was not the truth.
Never the truth.
Never the truth,
Never
but
the
it's
truth.
the myth
Yeah.
that we teach each other all the way up to freaking Reagan and now Trump, right? Like it's this go it alone um and I think that informs that idea of like, no, this is my place, right? Because I did it, I did this thing, and I had this experience, and it's one of the things that's really that I bump up against sometimes is you'll have folks say, but this was inevitable.
Mm, the
This is
inevitability
how,
story.
of course, land was going to happen. Of course, it would be
Right,
commodified.
right.
And it's like, what? No, this is actually not how every culture treats land. This is how we do. It might have been inevitable if you're prioritizing rugged individualism and capitalism and commodification, and racial hegemony and Christian hegemony. But if we don't assume those as foundational, then we can go different directions. And I totally think you're right that that's part of then what really hits people's core identity, because American identity is, even when we know better, like even when we know better, it's like, oh well, that's my diploma, right? That's my thing I did.
I love that that's my diploma example. Right. As if you got that diploma purely through yourself and not through everything else that was there
Yep.
to support you. Yeah, we know it's and like we only lift up the individuality, we don't lift up the collective on so many levels. And I think that makes it really hard that like when that mindness is challenged and when that ownershipness is challenged, like so like when you're working with people, how do you support their movement into the greater collective and not just into their own individuality?
So this is really funny. So I work with some clergy, some Christian clergy who talk about going where the spirit moves. And
Mm.
um not my tradition, but I see the value of that, right?
Uh-huh.
Like because there are some people who will learn this and will shut down, and that's okay,
Yeah.
right? They're like, "Whoa, that was really uncomfortable and I'm not ready for it." And if that's the case, I don't need to push you, right? It will do more harm than good for me to push you.
Mm.
But there are some people who are like, tell me more. what do I do next? How do I get into relationship with the story and with the people who are the descendants of the story who are not me? And I think that's the really key part, is to begin that relationship. And it's really hard because for the Indigenous folks who are descendants from the story, there's not a ton of trust. And so even when, so for example, I will have a client who says, okay, I need to return this cabin and do a land return to the tribe that this is from. Great, let's work on that. It will happen that the tribe is like, yeah, go ahead. But I don't need to meet you and I don't need to have a conversation, and that's okay. And so then that becomes my role to work with the client to show them like it's your act of repair is not dependent on someone else's act of forgiveness, because that's not what repair is. Repair is undoing your own harm, however the other person reacts. Repair is giving back the wealth that was not yours to start with, because it's the right thing to do, not because you're going to get a cookie on the other side.
Mm. It's so interesting. It's such a powerful and important thing you're saying, and it's so provocative and I mean that like it provokes folks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this comes up in kind of the work that I do all the time. Like something like this comes up all the time. And like I think what I often hear is a desire for an personal emotional connection
Mm-hmm.
with people who there and who with the descendants of the people who that person's ancestors harmed. Um, and I'm curious what you do with that. Like, how do you like, because and like, especially, I mean, sometimes someone might have land or financial abilities to return to people, and sometimes they don't.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not what their life has given them, right? At that moment when they're engaged with the stories, they might not have access to land or capital in a kind of clear and easy way. Either way, like how does one engage with like that kind of desire for connection that
Mm-hmm.
someone else may or may not particularly want?
I think so. First, I just want to express that there are ways to make repair without access to wealth or capital,
Mhm,
because white folks still have power.
mhm.
And there are ways to use that power in furtherance of others' goals and objectives, that return of power is its own return of wealth, because wealth is power, right? Like power is a kind of wealth.
You just give like one quick example of that because
So, for example, I'm working with a group now that is working to protect wild rice in Minnesota. And wild rice is central to the Anishinaabe creation story and migration story. It was actually part of the story is that the Anishinaabe migrate west to find where the creator said the food would grow on the water. And so when they found the wild rice in Wisconsin, Minnesota, they said, this is the place, this is where we are now. And through all sorts of different means, wild rice has greatly diminished in Minnesota and is under threat from sulfates and boating channels and all sorts of different things. And so this group is working to put some protections into state law that will help the wild rice thrive in today, all right, in present time. And so I stepped in, or I was invited to come and help draft the legislation. That's a thing that is not really a cost to me. I'm not returning wealth in a monetary sense, but the wealth that I have in that law degree that was not mine entirely to make, right? I can put that to use in service of their goal, right? I like wild rice. I think it tastes good. It's not central to my creation story, but I can tell that it is important to them and it is a way to use my power in support of their goals. So that's a way that we can use wealth that is not money wealth. It could also be for, I think of the back in the uprising, the white folks who marched and put down their own bodies because those bodies will not be hurt as much as Black and brown bodies will. That's another way to use your power. And it can be weird for white folks because we're told to step back, but now I'm telling you to step forward. So, like, what's that about? And really, that, and this comes back to your earlier question, it's about invitation and consent. Because if someone invites you into that relationship and asks you to lay down your body, asks you to draft up the legislation, that's a way that you can say, oh, okay, here I am, right? That's different than showing up and saying, I'm returning land and now I need an audience with the tribal council. That was not consented to, that was not invited. And so understanding there's that desire for relationship in that second one, right? The one that is not consensual. My job is then to work with that person to redirect to where that relationship can happen. So, okay, you're not going to get the relationship with the council that the audience that you want to feel good, but I can talk with you about why it's important for yourself to do that. And what relationship can you create with your people and your cousins to call them into what you've done? And the thing is, I know they'll learn the more that they do that and do it in an authentic way that is not about deploying power over people, but is inviting other people into a consensual relationship. That's going to invite the credibility that later on you're probably going to talk to the tribal council. But it's that going through and honoring relationship that you have and that you create instead of demand that really builds us all towards community.
The continual showing up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And showing up and listening. Like
Mm.
there is this story that I heard that a facilitator, Julica Herman de la Fuente, talks about, where there's a Black church in Texas who is having a, 50th celebration. I don't know what it is. And a white church clergy nearby says, how can we help? And they say, you know what? We need a sheet cake. Like everything else is taken care of. We just need someone to bring a sheet cake. And the clergy's like, great. And they go back and they form a committee and they figure out what the dessert's going to be. Are they going to make strawberry shortcake? Are they going to do a 3-layer cake? What's going to happen? And come back with whatever the thing is. And the thing is, the Black leader says, we just wanted a sheet cake. Our ally is the person who brought the sheet cake, not the one who went out and decided what better thing would better suit us.
They didn't bring a sheet cake?
They did not bring a sheet cake, but they learned that they should because the Black leader was generous enough with his relationship to say, here's what I actually needed. And the more we can trust each other for that and say, wow, I actually did not need that thing, but I need this. And the more we can be generous in listening so that when Indigenous folks say, we need land back, let's work on that. Or where people say, we need the power back. We need you to surrender some of that power. That's how we get to collective liberation. And honestly, that gets joyful. When you come out the other side and you have listened and undone the thinking that white folks have been conditioned with, and say, oh, this is how I actually behave in relationship that's consensual, that's joyful. It's revolutionary.
That a story reminds me of so what my primary relationship is with my beloved is an Indigenous woman. And one of the biggest things that I keep learning on kind of like a day-to-day basis in this relationship is how to listen for what she wants and not for what I think she wants.
Exactly.
And I can't tell you because I don't know. Like, I honestly don't know if that's a lesson I would have learned in any kind of super meaningful relationship with somebody else, right? Like, I don't know if her, like, I don't know, but I can't, because maybe that's just something I never quite learned. I never quite learned how to ask the question, okay, I might want it X way, a particular way, but what is it that you actually want? To kind of get into the nuance of that. Like maybe that I any maybe any really beautiful, loving relationship would have helped me get there, right? And in this case, it happens to be in a across a cultural difference. But I do know that it has not been an easy one to learn, which has surprised me. Because my conception of myself is that that I'm a really good listener, but turns out that like I missed a lot of nuances,
Mhm.
right? And it's been quite, and it's like it's been a very conscious practice of learning a different kind of, like a different kind of listening, but also like even just recognizing, oh wait, that's what I want. It's also learning like not projecting or
Right.
not assuming a whole bunch of things. And like, no, no, she actually doesn't like onions. Like it, like,
You just wanted a
no,
shake cake.
yeah, just want a sheet cake. Do not want all these other things. And it's also the drama of it, right? Like the desire.
Mhm.
I think we often, I think that's a human thing to some extent. We get caught up in the drama and then we feel good about ourselves because we spend so much time and effort. Like not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a lot of time and effort.
Or feel bad when they don't like it,
Right.
right? Like, what do you mean? It was really important to me to do this thing for you that you didn't want.
Right, 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 right. And that's something that many of us have experienced from other people. Like I
Yeah.
think like that's I think we know what that looks like often ourselves. But yeah, I'm with you. And so much of the depth of the depth of figuring out what relationality looks like is such a both humbling and ultimately very, very joyous experience.
Mhm.
And there's so much relief
Mhm.
in becoming right-sized.
Yeah.
uh, and in telling our own stories differently
Yeah.
and not having to be saviors either, not having to do everything
Right.
or be
Right.
part of all the different things that one could do either.
I feel like white folks don't quite understand how much work it is to guess what the rest of the world needs all the time and try to meet that.
Oh my goodness, the white man's burden. Yes.
Right? Like we can put that down, y'all.
Right. Like, yeah, actually, it doesn't have to be so hard.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, this is so rich. I want to kind of lift up your website. You have an incredible, like truly incredible collection of resources around everything from reparation to land back to thinking about money and inheritance differently. And it looks it looks like, and maybe this is wrong, but it looks like you keep updating it.
I
You keep
do.
putting more articles up there on a really wide range. Like you have quite a large range of categories. I really, really appreciate that. Um, and also, of course, ways and like just that alone to me is like super valuable, right? Like as a resource to be offering like everyone. Um, and and then of course there's lots of ways of working with you directly and whether that be as an organization or as an individual. Um, and I'm really yeah, this has been very, very rich. I think, I think that, yeah, this has been very, very rich. I'm really, really appreciative. And I think that we're kind of at a pretty good place. I think just like as a final question, it's like, because you talk so much about questions on your website, which I love. Like, what are the questions that we need to be asking? And you're kind of lifting that up. And I'm like wondering if there are some questions that you want to leave us with, that you invite people um, keeping in mind, of course, that we're not only this, many people might be listening to this episode from a variety of different places in their own journey as well as their own positionality. What are some questions that you invite for folks?
The one that's popping into my head just based on our conversation, which I really appreciate because I don't know that I would have had this question before, or put it this way, but where do you come from?
Mm,
Like, And that can be answered in so many ways.
Mm.
And just inviting folks into sitting with that question and what images or smells or ideas that evokes. What the I don't know if it's a question, but where I invite folks to spend time, we've covered a ton of ground here today, which I love. And if there was a place where the hairs on the back of your neck stood up, or you got goosebumps or shivers, or you went, oh, that's where the spirit is moving in a totally secular Jew sort of way. That's the place. That's where your intuition is telling you to go next. And so follow that and sit with that and wonder on what your questions are for that. Because that's the thing to hold next.
Thank you. That in itself, that your somatic invitation, the combination of somatic and spiritual, intellectual combination, that's so much a part of our work of remembering, is very much those questions, and kind of to let ourselves sink into it, and to let the responses have a multiplicity and a complexity and a diversity in it. And to know that all of that from which we come is part of what can carry us both into the land where we are, as well as into the present in all of its fullness.
Thank you so much for this. It was a gift.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and re-enchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summit Via website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarajolena.com.